Join me for a conversation with game designer Randy Engel.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. If you want to learn about me and some of my RPG resources, head over to dicegeeks.com, and you can find them there. It's just dice and geeks kind of squished together. All right, well, I have a fantastic conversation today. Let's just jump into it right now. My guest today is tabletop RPG designer and video game designer, Randy Engel. Randy, welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, no problem. It's my pleasure. How were you first introduced to tabletop role-playing games?
So I had this is a high school story. I had a girlfriend that sent me copies of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, and I was enamored. And I'm talking about them constantly. And my comrades in my physics class, my senior year physics class, are like, I guess we got to teach Randy how to play Dungeons and Dragons. And I go, hey, what's that? And so eventually I actually got to the table and rolled some characters and was immediately hooked and started on paper without even knowing what I was going to do next, designing an endless dungeon and all the pieces. And at some point somebody asked me, hey, the regular DM isn't coming tonight. Can you run something? And I'm like 2 weeks in, and I'm like, sure, I can do it. You guys help me with all the mechanics, right? And I ran this amazing adventure that I was hooked with, and they were all like, hey, you're pretty good. You could do this again next week. And that just sort of led to this idea that maybe I wasn't going to be an astronaut and a rocket designer. Maybe I was going to be a game designer, right? And I put myself through college learning programming and things like that, but I also worked at Chuck E. Cheese, and so I was the actual Chucky at one of the things, but that also meant I was the dishwasher and a lot of other things, and so I got to play a lot of video games and do a lot of stuff. And when in 1979, when Steve Perrin and Greg Stafford were having a talk at DunderCon about what it took to be a game designer, I asked the question about money, and they told me they had day jobs, that there wasn't anybody in tabletop game design, and I was mortified. They could tell I was distraught. And so Steve came over afterwards and talked to me, and he said, you could become a video game designer. And I was like, heck yeah, I could do that. And so I just started concentrating on that as a career path. And I was a programmer in a number of different companies, and then actually finally broke into video games. That's not the easiest thing in the world to do, by the way. And to pay my dues, I had to actually be the guy that answered the phone and help people set up their games and get them running on their PCs. And then I got to be the QA tester on a couple of games. And then finally, I got moved into the department that made Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo games. And I was told I was going to make either Falcon or Top Gun. They weren't sure yet. And but that was on the SNES. And I happened to know how to program the SNES and was coding away at that. And I was listening every day to the Star Trek team talking about Star Trek and realizing just how confused and befuddled they were, since none of them ever watched any Star Trek shows, right? And I felt bad, and I knew the game was horrible, but I'm not the guy on the team, right? I'm not there. And they went to Winter CES and they came back and they said, hey, we got really bad reviews from Paramount about this, so we obviously need somebody who's a fan of the show, and we're adding you to the team because at least you watch the show every week. And I said, well, what's my position? And they said, well, you'll be designer. We'll make you. And I said, lead designer? And they said, sure, we'll make you lead designer. And it was an amazing experience for me. I got to make what I called the penultimate fans version of Star Trek: The Next Generation, and really got to break finally from the being a programmer during the day to saying, oh, I'm going to make games for the rest of my life. And that's what it's going to be. Fortunately, before that, I actually made quite a few tabletop RPGs, and they aren't like widely distributed. They were mostly for friends or people at DunderCon. And but I made things like Ghost Chasers and Grave Robbers and Bonk, the caveman survival role-playing game, and just all kinds of different things that were fun. And that was the 80s. That was when everybody was learning, like, what is the depth and breadth of this industry and where's it going to go? And it was just an exciting time.
Yeah, I mean, and a lot of stuff there. I definitely want to follow up on some things. So you were introduced to Dungeons and Dragons, but then you started running games pretty quickly. You said, right? Like just 2 weeks. Yeah,
I didn't even know all the rules. I had bought the boxed set of the white box with the 3 pamphlets and the extra photocopies inside, and it was amazing, and yet it was completely incoherent, right? Like even I went back later and I asked Steve. I said, Steve, you came up with this whole parent conventions thing for people that were playing at DunderCon, and it's a percentile system and it's all these other things. And he says, Randy, did you ever understand the original books? And I said, no. And he said, neither did we. He said, we sat around, some of the smartest people in the world sat around looking at those books and going, there's some big holes here. And there were. And yet we all embraced that last paragraph, the one that you could just feel the hand of Gygax and Arneson there saying, these are the rules, but they're not rules, they're guidelines, right? This is for you to adapt and take. And so Steve came up with the idea of using, instead of memorizing spells, came up with mana points. And I think everybody in the San Francisco Bay Area that played used his percentile dice rules and mana points for spells, just because it made sense at the time, right? We're talking the end of the 70s and the early 80s, and everything else was very confusing. Thacos and, didn't even, that wasn't even a thing in the original book, right? It was later. And I was just like, the way I learned it was that way, which was kind of amazing because everybody who's in the video game industry was also in this area. Yeah. And so when they learned Dungeons and Dragons, they learned to use mana points for spells and all these things, and that translated immediately into video games, right? Like it's just uncanny how you can. There's all those historical documentaries about how the invention of steam power created all these industries afterwards, right? Mm-hmm. When you look at it, you go, "Oh, Steve came up with the idea of using percentile dice for 2-hit and mana points, and how that affected everything after it." And I got to work. I got to live alongside a lot of great developers besides Steve and Steve Perrin and Greg Stafford. Dave Hargrave ran the local store. He was the guy that I went to buy dice and new books and whatever. And he's the guy who did Ardu and Gamora, right? So like when you look at it, this was a very active area for game designers, and it was kind of natural that I fell into a lot of that. So.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's fantastic, and I don't think I had put that together that a lot of that was coming out of the Bay Area there in San Francisco.
Well, it's amazing because people have all this recollection of the Wisconsin guys and all the people associated with TSR, which I only have fleeting contact with, right? Like I get it. I understand that it's there and I know many of the names, but I wasn't part of their gaming group, right? I'd go back to be at Gen Con or something and hang with them and enjoy the gaming. But there were really these little satellites across the country of places, the guys at Judges Guild and all these different places that had, people in Texas, people in Wisconsin, people on the East Coast and the West Coast. So.
Yeah. And then, you said you ran one session and then they said, hey, why don't you do it again? Of course, that's how everybody becomes kind of the forever dungeon master or game master, is that you do it one time and everybody likes it and then you've got to do it again. Obviously a lot of people who listen to my podcast are running games. They want to get better at running games. What do you think? Do you have maybe a couple tips? What are some of your best tips for running a game? So
I've actually spent a lot of time thinking about this over the years, because one of the things that I noticed is that and I speak regularly at DunderCon now. I actually pointed out one year to all the organizers, I says, it would be great if we had a game master school. It would help drive more events to our things, because we'd be, upping the abilities of players to the point where they're able to comfortably take on the game master role. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we would offer a certificate or not, but having a little school that teaches people to be good game masters would be great. And we've always had seminars about game master tips and tricks and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But I actually believe that that there's some worthwhile, besides trial of fire, which is what everybody sort of does now, right? Is that there would be some benefit to this. And I thought a lot about it. And one of the things that occurred was I said, we need to teach some improv skills. This is the improv skills would have benefit players, LARPers, game masters, everybody. And so I started teaching 2 seminars the first year I did it that were just improv skills. And it was how, the improv is the yes, but idea, and you're plussing the idea of the person who came before you and making it all work. And so I came up with a number of activities that we could do as a group that felt like we were at a gaming table instead of on a stage performing comedy, and how improv benefits a gaming table. And they were a huge hit. And I've run it a few years since. And we now have professional improv people who come in and teach classes. And I think it's one of the clearest things that helps improve this is the ability to think on your feet fast enough to keep up with where the story is going, because your players are part of that storytelling, right? And so they need to understand that their cooperation creates opportunity for you as the game master to unveil more and interesting things for them to encounter, right? So I'm a big fan of that. On the second point, I'm a huge fan of your books and anybody else's books about how to lessen the prep time, how to effectively build procedurally, as we call it in the video game industry, content from tables and randomness that makes sense and works together. And so I love that stuff. And I think that between improv and sort of the no prep idea of how to build adventures and create stories, I'm I'm a fan of all that. I've recommended, and one of my best YouTube videos is about the 5-room dungeon format, and that, to me, storytelling in games really took a positive turn as people started realizing that there were templates that they could lay over their adventure designs that would help things feel more epic. And that is certainly what the 5-room dungeon has done for, I would say, thousands of game masters across the world.
Yeah. No, I've not done much with the 5-room dungeon, but I have read about it quite a bit. And
there are people who love it and people who hate it. And I always say your mileage may vary, but I think the idea of using a template, whether it's the hero's journey or the Harmon story circle or whatever is your template, the one I use a lot these days is called Kishu Tenketsu, which is a Japanese format that's essentially similar to 3-act, but it has a twist before the final act. And this is popular in Asia, and it's now become popular in the United States and parts of Europe. And what it does is it allows you to create horror and comedy games much easier than the 3-act structure does. And so I encourage people to learn this stuff, figure out how their storytelling works, and then try and impose it on their adventure designs in whatever way they can. So.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's I find all that stuff fascinating too. and thank you for mentioning my book as well, the No Prep Game Master. And you did a video on that, and I'm very grateful for you talking about it and listing my humble book among others that are giants in the field was very kind of you.
I have never. I mean, my roommate at DunderCon is Ken Hite, and I've never had the opportunity to shake Robin Law's hand. I do want to do that someday. Michael Shave from the the Sly Dungeon Master stuff. All of these guys are people that I know their names. It doesn't mean I've gotten to hang with them and spend a lot of time figuring out, how to pick their brains, but they're good people. I'd love to shake their hands. Right. So.
Yeah. Now, You said, of course, that you learned that there was no money in tabletop game design, so you went into video game design. And you did bring up something interesting that I don't think I had realized kind of on a conscious level until I had started doing some of these interviews. Because I have interviewed Mike Bro, who had worked at TSR in the 80s and went on to do a lot of video games.
A lot of tabletop people really finally made some money, some real money when they got into video games.
Yeah, and I was thinking about that because I know when I was growing up playing some video games kind of in the late 80s and early 90s, every once in a while I'd come across a game and or even multiple games, and I was like, man, this is just like basic D&D when we used to play. Like there's this, there's hit points basically, there's this, there's and I don't think I realized that how many people worked in the tabletop space then went on to to work on video games.
So not only that happened, but if you didn't know how to make an RPG, the first thing that you did is you went out to a tabletop game store, you bought a book on Dungeons and Dragons, and then you read it and tried to interpret it into your game design, right? And so even in that era that you're talking about, the late 80s and 90s, Japanese developers were ordering American editions of Dungeons and Dragons and trying to figure out what kinds of things needed to be added to their Japanese RPG, designs on the console that would make it feel like that tabletop experience. And I remember the challenge has always been, can you create an automated game master that makes things feel epic? And because I was here in the San Francisco Bay Area, people like Richard Garriott was going to school at UC Davis, which was 40 miles away. And he's a kid in his dorm room making Ultima, and, makes $100,000 in his first month of shipping Ultima, and, basically just changed the outlook that I had about, okay, finally there's some money in this, and I can see where the light is at the end of the tunnel. But he's a tabletop RPG guy at heart, and what he wanted to do was create an automated way so that he could, as a player, play in an epic story, right?
Yeah.
And to me, this has been a goal, and yet, as much as I worked in video games and created things like, I worked on Dungeons and Dragons for the Game Boy Advance and a number of different, RPGs in my career. There's a couple of things I'm known for, but RPGs and comedy games are very high on that list. Puzzle games and game shows. People don't get why I love game shows, but it's a very social way to engage in a game. Even if you're playing by yourself, you feel like you're playing with a bunch of other people, right? And so, what I've found is that nothing is ever going to replace the tabletop experience, because the tabletop experience is me and you and anybody else that's in our friend circle gathering together and having a good time tonight. And very rarely does that happen in video games, unless I'm on the couch playing Smash Brothers or Mario Kart. I don't have that same camaraderie, right? I'm usually playing by myself, and even if I'm playing a multiplayer online game, it doesn't have that same social connection as sitting around a table does. And so, as I got older and worked on more games, my heart was still drawn to tabletop games, because tabletop RPGs, it's the ultimate game. To me, it's amazing.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. It is the ultimate game. But yeah, I think what you were just saying there about, kind of replacing the dungeon master, replacing the game master, it is something that, I had thought about, of course, years ago, just, I'm, as I was playing a tabletop role-playing game, and I would try to explain, now, of course, if I need to explain a tabletop role-playing game to somebody, I just say, well, go to YouTube and check out these stuff. And there's like a million channels that they can check out and learn what a tabletop role-playing game is. But, in the 80s or 90s, that wasn't a thing, obviously. And so I would try to explain it, and I would say, hey, did you play this one game? Did you play this, I don't know, Final Fantasy or something on the Super Nintendo or whatever it was. And they're like, yeah. And I was like, okay, well, the game master is just like the computer coming up with all the, all the stuff, and the players are the ones reacting to it. And I was just thinking, when you kind of brought that up, is it is it a game master's desire to kind of to replace the forever game master's desire to kind of replace the game master position so they get to play once? Is that kind of the?
So I used to believe that was very true. That the very idea of automating things. Matter of fact, you look back at some of the innovations that you came up with, and I remember having one of those late night trying to drive back from a game with a good friend of mine, and I said to Stuart, Stuart, what if just like this Atari game system, there was a cartridge that you could plug in and it would play that adventure, and then there was like a television set that was your play surface, and so all the graphics will be rendered underneath your miniatures while you're moving around. And he's an electronic technician guy and engineer. And he goes, well, you need to have a way to sense the positions of the miniatures on it. And of course, all of that is now technology that we've solved, right? Like the Microsoft Surface had those sensors built in. It had the ability to render a game table underneath the miniatures that were on it and all the rest of that. And yet the part that we just assumed would be an easy part back in the late 70s, coding an adventure into a cartridge and then playing that cartridge with an automated AI of some kind, that's still really, really hard, right? Making an epic game, there are very few large, epic role-playing games in computers that are nearly as accommodating and flexible and as interesting as what can happen at a table when real players are playing together, right? And so I always feel like, well, that was a nice story, but what was my impact on the story, right? My impact on the story was I picked the right choices, right? Yeah. If that's all that my impact is that I guessed what the game designer was thinking, that's not really the same experience, right? So
yeah. And I know for all of the kind of talk and problems that players will give game masters who railroad them down lines, to me a video game is always a railroad, right?
Right.
It's, even awesome ones, right? Like even Skyrim, right? It's awesome. It's amazing. Right. But you go back to, you start at the, you've been playing for how many hours or whatever, and you go back to the beginning, you go back to that little village at the beginning. What do those characters say, right? They say the same thing they did when you were there before, right?
Absolutely. And by the way, the crew at Bethesda that's worked on, Fallout and Skyrim and all these games for over the years, back in their very, very earliest days in the industry, I ran a panel at the Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3, that had one of the Bethesda guys on the panel, and we were talking about the very same thing, exactly the same thing, about how we could create these amazing role-playing games, but were they as interesting as sitting around the table with your friends, right? Yeah. And it's funny is because I know Warren Spector and Greg Kostikian and Ken Hite and all these people that are amazing game designers, right? Whether they're in video games or tabletop games. One of the things that we argue about constantly is the definition of an RPG. And like you were saying about YouTube, sending people to watch a YouTube video that explains what an RPG is. Think about how many books we've opened where we have to sit through that same opening paragraph that explains it. And I'm like going, we still don't have a cohesive design. And so one day I sat down to talk about designing a role-playing game. And I said, I need a definition so that I'm clear about what I mean, right? And that doesn't mean that your mileage may vary and you may see something else. But I actually said RPGs are games where players create characters that develop over time, underlined, while exploring the game world, underlined, and overcoming challenges. And I like that one because it talks about character development, it talks about exploration and a world that you're playing in, and it talks about challenges. It doesn't always have to be fighting, right? And I like that definition, but in giving my talk at either tabletop game conventions or video game conventions, I've been attacked about it dozens of times because they'll say, oh, no, you got to put this in there or that in there. And what about this game? Well, you're right. That game doesn't have that in it. So is it still an RPG? That's an interesting question, right? Mm-hmm. And but I like that one. And use it to this day, even though I know it stands to be challenged every time I say it. So.
No, I think that is a really good definition, and it is hard to pin it down sometimes, because you will find, or I know I have, even in a limited experience, if I join somebody else's table, they're going to play a slightly different way than I had played, because I didn't have anybody to tell me how to, or something at a certain point in my life. I just or I ran with something the first Gamemaster, in the first session that I played with, and I just kind of ran with that. And I thought that was a way that kind of everybody used. But now we can kind of look at so many other sources and kind of synthesize kind of all of those things together.
So one of the things, and I play a lot at conventions. I don't get as many opportunities to sit around a gaming table with friends, especially during a pandemic. But in general, when you have a very busy career and a busy life, and your friends all move away and all that rest of the stuff, things get harder, right? And hopefully, we're seeing that the dawn of virtual tabletop and things like that allow us to once again game with our friends that have moved away. But again, that's not, it's a slightly once removed experience that's not quite the same as sitting there at the gaming table with all your miniatures and dice out and arguing about who's going to eat the last slice of pizza, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Or Doritos. There's usually a fight over Doritos somewhere in there.
The corn flavored shuriken objects that you throw at other players.
Yes. Yeah. Well, now to go back a little bit, you had mentioned that you one of your first games was a Star Trek game.
Yeah. This is amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And you were saying that you were a fan of the show. As I interview more and more people for the show, I think that D&D and Star Trek have launched, I don't know how many creative careers, because people they'll either cite D&D or Star Trek for kind of inspiring them to go into some kind of creative endeavor. And I just find that fascinating.
So because I started with Star Trek, I thought I was going to be a rocket engineer, right? I watched the original series. I went to the conventions. I dressed as Spock my junior year in high school. I was the first mate of the Star Trek club at my high school. And then the next year I was captain of the Star Trek club, which we renamed into the Science Fiction Club because Star Wars was coming. And I would go to comic book conventions and I would see the trailers for Wizards and I'd see the trailers for Star Wars. And I was just like, this is an amazing world that we live in, right? Like things are just going to get so exciting. And, this was early for the 80s, but think about all the fantasy entertainment that was available to us in the 80s with, Indiana Jones and Star Wars and scary movies and silly movies and just the list goes on and on of amazing things. And so here I was, this kid who grew up watching Frankenstein and Godzilla and things like that on creature features at night, on a Saturday night, to loving Star Trek and going to the conventions and falling in love with the girls dressed in their Logan's Run outfits and things like that. And then along comes the 80s, and here I am, a professional programmer. I can do almost anything I want to do, and I'm designing tabletop games like Ghost Chasers and Grave Robbers or Fairy Tale Adventures or any of these games that I created for my friends. And thinking, this is an amazing time in the world that we get to make entertainment and have fun, and we get to do it ourselves, right? Like we're doing this, we're making this what it is. And so it was an amazing time.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and you were naming some good ones back there. I'll throw in Dragon Slayer and Tron or something like that. But
when we were picking baby names, we were like, well, what about Lisette from Kroll? And I'm like, going, oh my God, how nerdy are we that we're picking baby names from genre movies that we happen to like, right?
Well, that is awesome. I mean, that is absolutely incredible. I think that is the first mention of Kroll on the podcast, and it is sadly too late because it should have happened sooner because Kroll was something else. But glad to hear that you were even considering that as a baby name. Well, number one, your wife must be awesome, I think.
So over the years, she had to give up on playing tabletop games, but she did play a lot of tabletop games with me. And this is a sad story about dating advice for GMs.
Oh, no.
When you invite your girlfriend over to be a character and you're going to GM, you have to be very, very careful because she probably knows everything that's in your brain at the time when you created that adventure, which we had just seen the Flash Gordon movie. And so the Stump Beast from the Flash Gordon movie was fresh in my mind. And I'm like going, what a great puzzle. I'm going to put that in the adventure, right? Mm-hmm. I'll just hang a key in the Stump Beast stump, and you need to get that key out in order to open the vault that the bad guy has in the dungeon, right? Mm-hmm. And she walks up to it. I describe it. She goes, oh, it's a Stump Beast. And she immediately puts her hand in thinking that she's just going to reach in and get a key out. And I made her roll, and she got stung by the Stump Beast. And she's like, well, what happens now? And I'm thinking that this budding relationship is about to end horribly as I kill her character. And her little brother, who had played Dungeons and Dragons before, was in the adventure with us, and he just looks at me and he's like, how is this gonna play out? Because he knows that she's dead, right? And I'm looking at her and I'm looking at everybody else at the table, and I'm like going, there's always a rule here that says that your God will intercede if you roll a D1000 less than your wisdom. And she's looking at me and goes, D1000, what's that? Everybody else at the table is looking at me like, Randy, what are you talking about? And I'd done this once before, one other time when somebody drank what I called the Dead Rat Pub martini, and they had to roll the D1000. But Sarah, my wife, to this day, rolled and got underneath her wisdom score, and her God interceded and saved her life. And her little brother just looked at me, shaking his head. God, I don't believe that just happened. I've got a big smile on my face, and she's got the key, and she's got this wound, but the ooze is coming out, and she feels much better later. And I'm like going, well, don't kill your girlfriend in the first adventure you invite her to.
Yeah. That is definitely that's probably top 3 in geek dating advice. Yes, don't kill your girlfriend the first time she plays Dungeons and Dragons. Don't kill a character the first time. Oh my gosh, that is so funny. But I mean, I'm still the naming thing is awesome. I like that. I like that would even be on the radar in baby names. I think is amazing.
we ended up, there was so it wasn't a girl that was born, so we didn't end up using Lisette, but we my wife and I both enjoyed a series of books from a guy who wrote the Master of Magics and the Six Magics and all these things. And he's a Caltech professor in quantum physics.
Wow.
And he wrote a series of fantasy novels with magic systems that were so complete and so exact that they were frankly amazing. And the characters and stuff in them are just great. And his name is Lyndon. And so our son's middle name is Lyndon, named after this author of this amazing magical book series.
There you go. There you go. So, when you had been such an intense Star Trek fan, to get to work on a game, I bet that was incredible, right?
Yeah. My favorite review of that game was from a magazine that said, obviously, Randy is a Star Trek fan extraordinaire, and he built the game that every Star Trek fan has always wanted. And that made me proud, because that's exactly what was going on while I was working on that project. So
yeah, I don't think you mentioned the title. What was the title?
So it had two different titles, but on the Sega Genesis, which is the one specifically that's exactly my design and exactly, I coded on it as well. Mm-hmm. That was called Star Trek: The Next Generation Futures Past for Sega Genesis.
Okay.
And there was a SNES version of that game. And because Sega was publishing the Sega Genesis version and my company that I worked for was publishing the SNES version, there were a lot of people involved at the very end of production on the SNES version that said, we don't trust that this is going to make a lot of money. We want to change it up. And here's the crazy thing. They were asking me to do stuff like dogfighting maneuvers and fly through the debris for space battle. And I said, you've watched Star Trek, right? Like, it's big ships. It's not it's not dogfighting. There's no flying through the debris of anything. It's not Star Wars. And they're like, no, we want that. And then they wanted phaser batteries, and they wanted med kits. And I said, so we're going to be exploring an old freighter ship that's been floating in space and resting for 10,000 years. And yet somehow the batteries and the med kits that are on board this ship still work, and they fit Federation equipment and human biology. Well, sure. I said, no. I said that you're breaking every rule of Star Trek by doing this. And of course they insisted that it be that way, and Sega insisted that it be the way I said. And so the version that was made for the Super Nintendo was much more arcadey and much more goofy, and frankly not as good a version. The graphics may have been slightly better, but we accomplished a lot on the Sega Genesis, and it's exactly like Star Trek. And I put in so much effort, so many amazing things in that Sega Genesis version. I don't know if you remember at the time, but every Sega Genesis game had to do something with the Sega logo.
Oh, yeah.
To make it their own. Mm-hmm. And I beamed it in. I thought, what better way than to start with a black screen and beam in each of the letters using a transporter?
Yeah.
And every effort that we made, we took the script, like frame by frame, took the script for the opening sequence and said, okay, we can't do this in 3D and we can't encode it as video, but what can we use with the assets that we have and all the pieces that we have to make this opening as exact as possible and time to the music? And we did it on the Sega Genesis. It was this amazing creation of pulling together all the planets and everything that the Enterprise flies past, and then creating that sequence. And we did a credit screen to roll all the people who worked on it over and show that the game was ending. And I said, we need to show the entire Star Trek crew. And they said, yeah, but the only photo that shows everybody all together doesn't have, Troy isn't in her blue uniform. She's in her dress. And it doesn't have Whoopi Goldberg. And I said, I can fix that. And I sat with an artist and we created this amazing piece of art that was all high color, high res. And I said, now we need to take it down to tiny tiles and 16 colors in each tile. And she looked at me and she says, Randy, there's nobody that's ever done this. And I said, remember, I'm a programmer. And every single tile got its own 16-bit palette. And so it looked like it was this high-res picture with lots of colors in it. And even Sega came back to me later and said, how did you do that? We can't show that many colors on one screen. And I said, yeah, you can. You just have to have an artist that's really willing to work with you on crunching that egg into a million pieces.
Oh, gosh.
And that was the kind of thing that we did. We just, we worked our butts off. It was for many of us, it was a matter of heart. I'm in the game as Damon Radney, the Ferengi spy, and my grandfather was the inspiration for one of the characters, a miner that you meet on one of the planets, and just everything that we did had this moment of let's put in another thing and put in another thing, and we just kept making it our own. And I actually asked permission from Paramount to create a new race so that we could shoot them cool. Like, people don't die very cool with phasers because they just fall to the ground or they disappear. I said, we need a race that dies cool. And Paramount's like, well, if you can find a place on this map that's empty, you can create a new Star Trek race. And I'd already had a number of problems with the writers on Star Trek, where every time I sent a new story idea, they would turn it into an episode and tell me I couldn't make it into the game. And so I finally said, okay, I get that this is a hard decision for you guys. I said, but your map is drawn on a piece of paper. Well, of course it is. It's a piece of paper that shows the map of the Federation and where the Cardassians are and the Romulans and the Klingons and everything. I said, yeah, it's a nice 2D representation. Here's a Federation and here's a bunch of bubbles around it. Who's above or below? They're like, what? I said, space is 3D. Come on. Who's above or below the Federation? And they said, well, you found a place that you could put this. And so I drew a circle that was a dotted line above the Federation. And I said that this is where the Chodak are. And the Chodak were a bunch of frogs that ultimately my inspiration was, what happens to a frog if you put it into a microwave? It should explode, right? Well, if you shoot the Chodak with a Federation phaser, they glow for a moment and then they explode. And it looked really cool in the Sega Genesis game. So that was what the Chodak were. And then later, when they came out with Voyager, they named the number one, the guy that was assistant to Janeway, Chakotay. And I'm like going, that's awful close, guys. And they go, hey, it was a good name. You came up with a great name. We just modified it,
So I think I caught in there somewhere you were saying the writers on the show took your ideas and made them into episodes.
Oh yeah. So there's a pretty famous episode where Picard talks about this mentor that he had who taught him archaeology, and he meets this woman, and she's like a crypt robber. And they go on this adventure together, and I love that episode. That to me was the perfect Picard episode, where he falls in love, and yet he can't. He's a Starfleet officer. Can he really live a life as a crypt robber and with his new girlfriend, right?
Yeah.
And I said, that was such a touching episode. I want this episode to be inspired by his love for archaeology. And so that was the premise, is that he goes to rescue somebody, and at the time, it's this mentor that was an old Vulcan woman who called on him because she had been his instructor in Starfleet Academy on archaeology. And she's explained how she's uncovered this chain that links a lot of the species in this galaxy together with a common bonding. And the guys, the Star Trek writers, loved this idea of the mentor and the fact that all the species in the galaxy, the reason why everybody was a biped with just different wrinkles on their faces was because of this common bond and this ancient civilization that existed before. And so they actually wrote that episode. And if you remember, there was this amazing scene where the Cardassians and the Romulans, and here's Dr. Crusher and Picard on the planet, and they're sneaking around the DNA strips, and they finally activate this hologram that gives the famous line that why all species in the galaxies are related is because you're all descended from us. Mm-hmm. And that was a beautiful episode. Well, I had the exact same episode. It's just that they said you can't do it because we're going to write that into, into the series. And I said, well, what if I used a Dyson sphere? And they said, we have an episode with the Dyson sphere. I know you do. What if it was around a 3-sun system and it was used to manifest reality? And they're looking at me like, we can't possibly do that. We don't have the resources as a television show to model all this epicness and do all this stuff. I said, great. So I can do it in my video game, right? They said, yeah, if that's what you want to do. And so they approved my storyline and gave me the Chodak so that I could shoot, dramatically and all these other amazing things that I got to work on, including I had to sit there at a meeting and argue about what a red dwarf was and what a brown star and all these different, like all these astronomical terms, because if it wasn't in a script from Paramount, they didn't know what those things were. So we actually had to buy them an astronomy book so that they knew what a wormhole was. And they said, well, you can't call it a wormhole. And I said, well, we'll just call it a hyperspace link or something. And because they were working on Deep Space Nine and they hadn't told us that yet. So they would, that had a wormhole. So it was like all these things that we had to be careful not to do. And then they had to know that this giant database of Starfleet outposts and things like that I'd put into the computer system. They said, were those actually in scripts? And they said, no, not all of them, because I took the ones that were in scripts and noticed that you guys had a numbering system, and I just filled in the blanks. Oh, we have a system?
Oh my goodness.
So somebody in your writers figured out a system. They just hadn't used all of them yet.
Yeah.
And it was fun. It was a fun project to work on because of all the amazing stuff that you got to do. But
yeah. All right. Well, and if somebody wants to check out some of those episodes, the first one you mentioned where Picard meets a female tomb robber, that one is called Captain's Holiday. They can check that one out. And then the one where all the species are aligned, I believe that is a 2-parter called The Chase, I believe. Yeah. So if anybody is going back and rewatching Star Trek The Next Generation, they can check those out. Now, we talked about a lot about your career and that. What are you up to now? And
so over my career, I got to work on things like, besides Star Trek, I got to work on Lego projects. I got to work on Lord of the Rings. I got to work on the Game Boy Advance version of Eye of the Beholder. I got to work on things like Nicktoons Winners Cup Racing and Scooby-Doo games and SpongeBob games and the list goes on and on of all the kinds of things that I got to work on. I built my own studio in 2001 with some friends as partners, and we ended with in 2008 when the financial crisis hit. We had 45 employees, and we're making about a dozen games a year. And some of the most amazing kinds of things that I could work on there. Toys, we actually got very big in the toy industry, making electronic toys that would plug into your television set. And so I did Deal or No Deal and 1 versus 100 as plug and play game shows where you would plug it into your television set, turn it on, and then you were the contestant in those game shows. And a lot of other toys like that. And we won Toy of the Year for a Rescue Heroes toy that we did. But the financial crisis really, it destroyed the studio. I had to suffer personal bankruptcy and lost my house and everything else. It was,
oh gosh,
yeah, it was a bad time. But I went to work for a number of the startups that were booming because the smartphones had come out, and I had already worked on mobile games back when it was Brew and Java and flip phone days, the Razors and things like that. And we had made a ton of those games, and literally, I think it was 270 million copies of Ms. Pac-Man were sold on Razor phones. So,
wow!
It's when you think about where those sales are, you go, "Where's my slice of that?" we were doing it for a client. Well, that was the part I loved about doing Deal or No Deal. Is I walked into the toy company and I said, what do you know about Deal or No Deal? And they said, well, we know it's a #1 show on NBC, and it's got this guy Howie Mandel in it, but he's a washed up has-been comic, and it, just like they didn't have very fond things about it. I said, have you seen an episode? And they go, no, I wouldn't watch crap like that. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And I knew what his magic number was. I knew his magic number was $90,000. He wanted to do this game for nothing. And I said, I'll do it for $70,000. And his eyes just practically bounced out of his head. And I said, but I want a nickel on every copy you sell. He didn't even do the math. He's like, Randy, we don't do royalties. We're the toy industry, not the video game industry. I said, I know. But do you tell me you can't teach your accountants to count how many and give me a nickel for each one? And he goes, Randy, that's silly. And I said, listen, I'm giving you a break on the cost. And he thought about the $20,000. And he goes, all right, a nickel on each one. 4 years, he sent me $10,000 a month check on the royalties of that one game.
Well, there you go. All right. I'm going to mark it down in my book, royalty. All right.
So if you can get a penny or a nickel out of the sale of something, do it,
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, wow. Wow. And now...
So since I worked on all the free-to-play stuff, and I actually helped build, unfortunately, I helped build a lot of the systems and mentality and how you use analytics to track sales and all the rest of this stuff, and realized that it was all being used to make really horrible games, right? Like the free-to-play business is not what it could have been. It's what they could get away with, right? Okay. It's how they could abuse people as opposed to how they could really make it all work. And so I started doing less and less of that. And I went and did some teaching at the Academy of Art in San Francisco and loved that, loved doing the teaching. Mm-hmm. And then I started doing consulting and doing a lot of consulting, like helping MMOs and kids games and just a large number of different clients. And invariably they would come back and say, Randy, can you put together a team and work on that for me? And I finally said, hey, I've got some old students and some friends of mine from when I ran a studio. I'll make your game. We'll do it on a budget. We'll figure it out. We'll make it all work. And so I did that for a number of years. And California last year passed a bill called California AB5 that makes it illegal to contract and freelance. The idea was to protect drivers for Lyft and Uber, but it shut down being an indie studio and hiring people to help you.
It doesn't make any sense.
It's horrible. It's horrible. It's absolutely the worst thing. It's made me consider moving away from California just to be able to run the kinds of businesses that I want to run.
Yeah.
And that you have to be an employee now in order to do this. And of course, as of today's election, Uber and Lyft paid millions and millions of dollars to put a new bill on and they're now excluded from this law. So all that it's hurting is the little guys like me that run tiny little game studios, or musicians that have a band, or guys that build websites and do, Fiverr jobs for people and things like that, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's just this horrible result, and a system that didn't protect the drivers for Uber and Lyft, right? So I look at it and go, okay, what am I going to do? So right now, I have I created an entire 10-class curriculum for Kanata College, which is a local community college near me. And I teach online the classes, and I have about 60 students a semester that go through my classes and get a certificate that helps them get a job in video games. And a few of them are even interested in doing tabletop games. So I always encourage them to follow that path too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I mean, you should move to St. Louis. You can do anything you want. Oh man.
The idea of me hiring somebody to help on a project as a contractor, because think about it, you're a small company, right? You're not like, you don't need somebody to build your website for 12 months.
Yeah.
You need somebody to build your website next week.
Yeah.
So if I have to make them an employee for a week, how is that working? And yeah, it doesn't make any sense, and it's as broken as can be. And I've talked to lawyers, and there's just no good solution except for, let's move to another place and see what happens next. Right? So.
Oh my goodness. All right. But I've had you on a long time, but I'll give you a chance. You are also really active on YouTube, and you're designing some small games, and that could you let people know where they could find some of your YouTube videos? And then you are working on some kind of smaller, faster tabletop RPGs, right?
Yeah. So this is something that grew out of me making video games 22 years ago. I went to a seminar that the guy says, make games that are SMAF, and nobody knew what that meant, and we made up the word. But it means smaller, faster, and funner in his case. But then I realized that funner isn't really a word, so why not make it funnier, right? And so I continue to this day to use that metaphor of using small teams to make games that the actual work itself is fun, because it reflects in the final product. When the team is having fun, the game is fun. And the second part of that is, we have a lot of giant games where you have to buy $150 worth of books before you have the full set, and maybe not even the full set, right? Because 3 more come out next year. Yeah. And I look at this and go, how do you make a game that, back when I was having fun in the early 80s playing these games, I can buy the game and enjoy it, something like Ghostbusters or Toon or anything like that, and just have fun. And many times we would use those to fill in that empty space that was, Bob's sick and he's not going to come today. So instead of, playing without Bob, let's play a one-shot. Mm-hmm. And so I said, that's a niche that I think that I can do a really good job with. It's already something that I talk about in my YouTube channel, and I love it. So I'm going to make games that are smaller, faster, and funnier, and they're easier to learn. They're silly. They parody things and they satire things. And so I did that. And then, of course, for something like 35 plus years, I've had my tabletop publishing company that it's just me self-publishing my games. And I call that Hopspush, and it's named after one of my first D&D characters, Garrico Hopspush, who was a healer back when healer was a thing in the Dragon magazine. And that character has stuck with me, like I said, for over 40 years. So my company is called Hopspush, and people go, how do you spell that? And I said, it as crazily as you can possibly spell it. So it's HOPPSBUSCH.com. And from there, there's links to my YouTube channel, my Twitter feed, and all my games. And I'm working on right now, because the Kickstarter failed, I am converting Gruesome Ghoulies, which is my latest creation, from a bigger game to a RPG zine-size game. And I already have Kaboomkin up there, which is an RPG zine of fairy tale, post-apocalyptic cartoon mayhem. And there's going to be a lot of games on there. My goal when the pandemic hit got sort of delayed and stretched a bit. But my goal is to have between 5 and 6 different RPGs published every year under my own label on hopspush.com. So.
Okay. And I will make sure to provide links to your site and your YouTube channel and everything in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com, so everybody can check that out. Now, you also mentioned a convention, right, that you're involved in as well.
Yeah. So I help as a committee member, a volunteer position at DundraCon, which is dundracon.com. And the event that I'm responsible for is a 4-day prototype game development, basically just a marathon where designers bring their games in and players play. They get tickets for each hour of play that they participate in these prototype games. And then we auction off, sweepstakes off prizes that the sponsors have given us, which usually include like a $40 game. And so players love it because they're getting games. Designers love it because they're getting to test their prototypes. And we have publisher meetups, and it's an awesome, participating in a protospiel or a prototype game event of any kind is an awesome way to take your creativity and become a designer, and then find those channels and places where you get to publish your own games. So.
Okay. Well, I'll provide a link to DundraCon as well in the show notes for this episode.
Brilliant.
Well, Randy, I mean, it was a pleasure speaking with you today. I know I probably derailed it. Anytime somebody mentions Star Trek, I start going down rabbit holes and things like that. But thank you so much for being on the show today.
It was a real pleasure, Matt. You've got a great channel here, and I appreciate being a guest today. Thanks.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Randy today. As you can see, he has been around the industry for a long time and has a wealth of knowledge to share. As I mentioned, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode where you can check out Randy's YouTube channel and some of his games. I really urge you to do that. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you'll get an email update from me letting you know what I am up to here in the world of Dice Geeks. Now, if you like this show and you enjoy these conversations that I had, like the one I had with Randy today, please consider supporting the show in some way. You can like, subscribe, rate, review wherever you're listening to this show. Even something as simple as pressing a rating button or a like button helps the show immensely, and I would appreciate every single one of those. Also, if you would like me to keep making these episodes, one way you can ensure that is by going over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and supporting the show financially. That would mean the world to me. All right, guys, I thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.